Hi, that was Miles Davis doing Green and Blue. I hope you enjoyed the music. My name is Tom Thurston. I'm with the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, and we are hosting this meeting. But this really is developed by the Amistad Committee, and I have the honor of being a member of the Amistad Committee, which is dedicated to fight for social justice and telling the history of African Americans in New Haven, Connecticut, and around the world. And with me is Kai Perry, who's the president of the Amistad Committee. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Kai, and you can introduce the program. Can't hear you.
Thanks, Tom, for the introduction, and thank you, Gilder Lehrman Center, for hosting another webinar for us. So on behalf of the Amistad Committee, I am pleased to welcome you to this webinar to increase awareness of the ongoing struggle for human rights. The United Nations declares December 10th as Human Rights Day because this day in 1948 was the day when the General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Human rights is at the core of our current day struggles for social and racial justice. From immigrants being detained at our borders, that's a human rights issue. Climate change reform is a human rights issue. Police brutality is a human rights issue. The nationwide debate about teaching critical race theory in our schools is a human rights issue. Equal access to healthcare is a human rights issue. All these issues and so many more are attacks against our fundamental human rights. So in an effort to bring greater attention to the importance and relevance of human rights, the Amistad Committee has partnered with the city of New Haven. And with the city's help, we have requested that the New Haven Register print the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the newspaper today. So check the newspapers. The main public library has erected a human rights display of literature and resources for community members to explore. And every student in New Haven Public Schools in grades 6 through 12 have been given a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And to top it off, we are inviting high school students to compete in our annual Tony Harp essay contest. I'll share the flyer with you all a little bit later. But today launches that essay contest. And we're inviting high school students in grades 9 through 12 to write an essay, oh, there it is, reflecting their ideas, interests, and insight on the socio-political events of 2020 and 2021. So in 500 words or less, they'll be asked to discuss how human rights are impacted by current day issues. And we want the responses to be evidence-based and reference the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. We're pleased to be awarding the winners in each grade level, grades 9 through 12, with a $300 book award. Second place, $200, and third place, $100. The deadline for this essay contest is February 10th, 2022. And you can email that essay to me directly at kperry@discoveringamistad.org. So please share and spread the word with any high school students you all know in the New Haven area. Make sure that they get an opportunity to express their ideas and compete for some funding. So now I have the opportunity to introduce our speaker for today's webinar. Dr. Vijay Prashad is an internationally renowned human rights activist. He is the executive director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. He is the chief correspondent for Globetrotter. He is a professor and author, with his most recent book being entitled Washington Bullets: with a preface by Evo Morales Aima. Dr. Prashad is currently working today in Caracas, Venezuela, and has notified us that his internet connection is unstable. So he has prepared a video of his lecture. We hope we can secure a stable audio connection perhaps later for some question and answer after the lecture. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the lecture. Oh, there he is.
It's great to be with you today. It's Human Rights Day. I'm in Caracas, Venezuela, where the United States illegal sanctions regime against this great country has put an enormous burden on both the people of the country and, of course, the government, which is trying very hard to deliver basic resources to the people, including electricity, and, of course, therefore, the internet, but also the kind of resources necessary for the pandemic. A country like Venezuela has its finances outside the country blocked by the US government. In fact, Venezuela was trying to buy vaccines from COVAX, the vaccine alliance, which was set up with the help of the World Health Organization to enable countries like Venezuela to get access to vaccines. And the Swiss bank, UBS, which got an order from Venezuela to pay for the vaccines, refused on the grounds that there were the US sanctions. I'm going to come back to why these are illegal sanctions, because it has a lot to do with the United Nations and its standard of legality and illegality. We've come together on Human Rights Day, and I'm sending you this message because there's no guarantee that there will be electricity or the internet at the exact time when you've come to this celebration of Human Rights Day. And I wanted to be sure to get you this message, so I taped it. It's Human Rights Day, which in fact celebrates the ratification by, at the time, almost 60 countries in 1948 of the International Declaration of Human Rights. Now, this declaration is interesting. It's typically not seen as international law because it's non-binding, or at least large parts of it are non-binding. It's a set of principles that the world accepts. And in 1948, when it came before the UN General Assembly, nobody voted against it. It's important to note that everybody voted for it, including the country where you are, the United States. It voted for the International Declaration of Human Rights, recognizing that the rights listed in the declaration are non-binding, but nonetheless significant. They include, for instance, the right to shelter. You are in New Haven, Connecticut. The level of houselessness is extreme in a place like that. You see people on the street, even in the winter. The Declaration of Human Rights puts forward the right to a job. Unemployment is a significant problem. Governments seem to have washed their hands on trying to produce decent work for people. Decent work, by the way, is a term used by the International Labour Organization, another organization of the United Nations. Governments have washed their hands on producing decent work. The UN Declaration of Human Rights also talks about the right to an education, a good quality education. This is significant. It's something that should be at the table. Equitable education. Not that you have highly funded private schools and poorly funded public schools, or some public schools better funded than others, but you have equity across schools. And you have a situation where students going to colleges don't have to take enormous debt. In the United States, students carry over $1 trillion, with a T, $1 trillion of student debt. It's unconscionable. It's against the spirit of the International Declaration of Human Rights. If today I was to list all the articles of the International Declaration, and if we made a scorecard and saw how the different countries did against the scorecard, like right to education, a right to house, right to a good job, right to food and nutrition and so on, right to a certain level of culture, I would say that a country like the United States, a very rich country, would come up with a very poor score. Now, it's true that there are lots of very rich people, but there are also too many poor people. And a country should not be judged by the number of rich people it has. It should be judged by how it deals with the poor. That's what I think is a good definition, a good measure of democracy. So I would say that if we were to use the International Declaration as a standard, it would not be a standard that shows a country like the United States, a rich country, in a very good light. Now, I'm going to take one issue to highlight on this question of the International Declaration of Human Rights, and let's see what we learn when we go through it, and that's going to be the issue of hunger. If we look at the declaration, you will see that the question of hunger is raised repeatedly. There are many articles in the declaration that reflect on one or the other measure of hunger. The question of hunger is an interesting one. People sometimes say, okay, there are people who are hungry because they are lazy and they don't work and so on. There are lots of explanations for why hunger exists, even though the principles in the International Declaration of Human Rights declare that people have a right to food, they have a right to sustain themselves and so on. So why do hungry people exist? I want to spend some time on that. Well, recently I looked at the United Nations figures, and the UN figures showed that there are about 2.7 billion people in the world, that's with a B, 2.7 billion people in the world who don't know where their next meal is going to come from. That's significant. Some of you may also be in the ranks of the 2.7 billion who don't know when your next meal is coming or what it will be. I don't mean what will be on the menu, but will you be eating food, or will you be just drinking water or bread or something like that? It's a serious issue around the planet. 2.7 billion people, my friends, that's 1 in 3 people. 1 out of every 3 people is struggling with hunger. Now, it's interesting. You say, well, that's because maybe there's too many people on the planet and, there's too little food produced. We have a problem of greater demand and less supply. There's less supply of food, but there's a lot of demand for food. Maybe that's it. Maybe the 2.7 billion are not eating well enough because there's too many people on the planet. Well, you can leave that thought behind, because if you go to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, which looks at these matters with great seriousness, and you can also look at the World Food Program, which also has reports on this, all available on the internet, you will find that in fact it's not the case that there are too many mouths to feed and too little food. You will find that in fact there is enough food produced every year to feed 14 billion people. That's twice the number of people that are on the planet. That means we have enough food on the planet to feed people, and yet 1 in 3 people don't get enough to eat. That's a serious question. How is it possible that there is food enough for twice the number of people on the planet, and yet a third of the people just don't have enough to eat? What's the answer? Here's a group of hungry people, and there's a grocery store with food in it. What prevents the people from eating? Here's a group of hungry people, there's a restaurant. There's food there. What prevents the people from eating? What prevents the people from eating is money. They don't have money. And if they don't have money, they can't buy food. And if they can't buy food, they starve. Money is what prevents people from eating, not that there are too many people and there's too little food. There's enough food, there are hungry people, but the hungry people don't have money. Then the question must be asked, why don't they have enough money? Lots of explanations are put out there. People are lazy, they are addicted to various narcotics, there's all kinds of things like fate, bad luck, and so on. This is not an adequate answer. The reason they don't have money is that we don't have a civilization that puts people ahead of profit. Um, we don't have that civilization. Our civilization puts profit in front of people. In other words, for people who have a lot of money, which we call capital, a lot of money, more than the money they need to survive, that money is invested to make more money. It makes the people who own that money or that capital into capitalists. The capitalists who have this stock of money and then want to make more money look for good ways to invest their money. And what they find, in fact, the better investments are made investing in money. In other words, they invest in financial instruments, they invest in the stock market, and so on. There's a large gap between the value or the use of that stock market capital. There's a large gap between the use of that stock market capital and job making. A lot of the money that goes into speculative activity in Wall Street, in the Frankfurt Financial Platz, in the City of London, and so on, a lot of that money does not appear over time in the creation of jobs, in the making of, say, a factory, or the building of a shop, or the creation of an agricultural venture, and so on. A lot of that money just circulates as money. Some of it goes off into tax havens. In fact, $38 trillion sits in tax havens that are illegal all around the world. So you have this tendency of people who have money, the capitalists. They want to make money on their money. They don't want to make jobs. Their profit motive is profit, not job creation. So what you have is a lot of money goes into unproductive activities. And the people who have a lot of money are also able to put the pressure, political pressure, on the political forces in their societies to ensure that they don't raise taxes. You see, they make the argument that if you raise taxes on the rich, you'll end up slowing down economic activity. This is not true. If you tax the rich, what you're largely taxing is unproductive financial investments. And if you tax the rich there, you can use that money for productive use. You know, the government can get into the act of, in a city like New Haven, buying up empty properties and creating housing. Putting to work people who don't have jobs, refurbishing, winterizing the broken housing stock in the city, bringing in the abilities of people to move from carbon-based energy to green energy. But to do all that, you need money, and therefore you need to tax the unproductive, speculative activities of the very rich. And once you get that money back into the economy, like blood flowing, through the system, then you're able to have money in the hands of people, and then they eat. Now, I believe that, you should be able to eat even if you don't have money. We should build a system where food is not something that you need to rely on money to have, but the government provides for the very hungry kitchens where they can come and eat. I just think that that's a moral obligation that should be separate from the economic system. In many places in the world where there's a kind of socialist government, whether it's Kerala in my native India, or it's in Venezuela, very poor country, yet they do this, or in Cuba, there are community kitchens where you can come and eat for either very little money or none at all. You can just donate some money. But food is not treated as a commodity alone. It is a commodity, but it's also provided as a moral gesture. Society is entitled, it feels imperiled to do this. In advanced countries like the United States, you do have some people who give food away, churches, for instance, or mosques, religious institutions, and so on. But these are few and far between. And then it's left to their hands to do it. The government absolves itself, doesn't take responsibility, doesn't acknowledge that it has a role in making sure on a democratic basis that people are fed, clothed, housed, educated, as healthy as possible, and so on. These obligations that stem, my friends, from the International Declaration of Human Rights is a very key text. So you see what I mean, that we looked at the question of hunger and we saw that people are hungry not merely because they don't have enough food in the world, or because they have bad luck and so on. Most people are hungry because the system has no way of employing everybody, and therefore they don't have money, and if they don't have money they must starve. It's a very cruel system, and we need to really think hard whether our moral compass can tolerate a system so cruel for decades and decades and decades, and we have to think about whether we want to change things. So that's the question of hunger. Now, the International Declaration of Human Rights was passed in 1948 by the General Assembly. That's 3 years after the United Nations was formed. When the United Nations was formed, there were about 50 countries that were founding members of the United Nations. Now, when you set up something like the United Nations, you have to actually have some understanding of why you're coming together. You have to have a text which everybody says is a binding text. Remember, I said that the International Declaration of Human Rights is largely non-binding. Some of the sections in that document have now entered into force and are binding in various treaties and obligations signed by the countries. They've taken some sections of the declaration and made them binding. But the general tenor of the International Declaration of Human Rights is that it's a non-binding text. You can't build an organization around a non-binding text. You have to have some text that everybody accepts and says that they will honor. They will live by its axioms. They will live by its laws. When the United States was founded, for instance, it was founded around a constitution. You had so-called founding fathers gather and write a constitution. Everybody agreed, look, we're going to abide by this constitution. The United States is held together by this constitution. In the same way, the constitution of the United Nations is called the UN Charter. It was drafted in 1944 and 1945, and it was adopted in 1945. 50 countries signed the UN Charter. Today, there are 193 countries that are members of the United Nations, 193 countries. Each of the countries that's a member of the United Nations is therefore a signatory of the UN Charter. This is important. The UN Charter, therefore, has been accepted as an important binding document by 193 countries around the world. There is no other text that has been produced in human history that is as much a consensus document, a document of agreement. There is no text produced in the entirety of human history that has as much legitimacy as a binding text to which every person through their countries adheres as the UN Charter. The UN Charter, therefore, is the most important document. It's more important than the UN Declaration of Human Rights because the Declaration of Human Rights, as I said, is not a binding document, although some parts of it subsequently have been made binding. UN Charter, on the other hand, is a binding document. Every country is bound by it. They have to follow the points made in the UN Charter. Now, one of the most important aspects of the UN Charter is to create a system of security and prevent war. Because you can't really deal with issues of hunger and so on if you are focused on war. Take the United States. United States has got the world's largest military budget. If you add everything, including the CIA and the National Security Agency and so on, US military budget is about $1 trillion. It's a lot of money every year that goes to this budget. You have the nuclear capacity, you have bombs that can obliterate countries and so on. By the way, it's not altogether that useful because you can have bombs that obliterate countries, but the United States has not been able to successfully win many of its recent wars. Hasn't won the war in Iraq, hasn't won its political aims, hasn't won the war in Afghanistan, in fact defeated, hasn't won the war in Libya, in fact no political aims were secured there. You can have a huge military, but you're not really winning politically. Nonetheless, an enormous waste of money goes into the military. And linked to that, the United States produces and sells abroad military equipment, weapons of all kinds, planes, ships, tanks, and so on, to countries around the world. 40% of world arms sales come from the United States. That's incredible. I mean, it really shakes your sense of moral righteousness when you think that the United States is one of the world's largest arms dealers. I want you to think about that. It is the world's largest arms dealer. So the UN Charter is very important because the UN Charter of 1945 is seized on the idea that let's try to produce a pathway to peace so that we're not building always for war. And if we're not building for war, then we can use our surplus, our huge resources to build for peace. If people are well fed, if they have, many of their things taken care of, they won't have to, they may not. There's a less chance that they will go into areas of conflict and so on. So many of the conflicts we have are conflicts over resources, conflicts over frustration, old historical conflicts that cannot be resolved, for one reason and the other. But could we use our resources to help resolve them? We've not really tried because we spend so much of our human potential building towards war. So in that sense, all this war making is against the spirit of the UN Charter. But more particularly, you see, one of the things that the UN Charter establishes, that now there are 193 countries. Each country is sovereign. That means a country cannot be interfered with. It has its own laws and its own processes that it follows. Secondly, it can't be interfered with. Other countries cannot intervene either with force or even not force to influence that country. This is an established principle in international law, that the sovereignty of countries is an established principle. And linked to that is the principle that you can't intervene in a country. But the UN asks a serious question. The Charter asks a serious question. Can the United Nations, as a collective body, can it tell a country, a member country of the UN, that it's not doing something correctly? What if, for instance, now take the case of 1945. The countries have met, they're writing a charter up. They just came out of the Second World War, where there was the hideous Holocaust, the killing of Jews, of homosexuals, of gypsies, of communists, and so on by the Nazis in the war camps, the death camps, the concentration camps, and so on. Hideous killing of at least 6 million Jews and then others killed, millions of others killed. This was the immediate context in which the UN Charter was written. So you can't say sovereignty of nations, let the Nazis proceed inside Germany because it's inside Germany. How does the international community develop a procedure to intervene in spite of the fact that you recognize the sovereignty of nations? So that's an interesting question. 2 chapters in the UN Charter explicitly talk about this problem, Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. What the UN says is that, look, we have a General Assembly of all the countries in the world, and then we have something called the Security Council, where there will be eventually 15 countries with 5 permanent members: France, United Kingdom, United States, Russia, and China, the 5 permanent members, and they've been the 5 permanent members since 1945. Why there should be permanent members, that's a big debate, but set that aside. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 of the UN General Assembly make the following argument. If the UN Security Council establishes that there is some bad behavior happening by a government inside to its own people or to its neighbors, and if the UN Security Council is democratically able to establish that the situation there is not good, later there will be a convention on genocide which will establish the criteria for genocide and so on. If there's a condition of genocide or there's aggression against a neighboring country, then the UN can act. So chapter 6 says there are a set of actions that are possible. There can be economic sanctions, there can be diplomatic isolation, and so on. And chapter 7, the more harsh one, says that the UN can authorize a military intervention to stop whatever atrocity is taking place. Both actions under Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 of the UN Charter require a UN Security Council resolution. That means the 15 members of the Security Council that meet in the horseshoe table in New York City have to all agree to the fact that there is a problem in a country somewhere, that there is some violations taking place of basic international law, and that the countries of the world need to act through the UN. And so the UN Security Council then forms a resolution. They first talk to the country and allow them to come and discuss in the UN, what are you doing? And they give their own view, and then there's an argument. Eventually, if the Security Council agrees on some problem, they will file a resolution. If that is passed, based on that resolution, you can start a series of policies that constrain the right of the ability of that country to act. You can do economic sanctions and so on. But you require the Security Council resolution to do anything like that. See, the problem right now that we are facing around the world is the United States government is conducting sanctions regimes against about 30 countries in the world, including Iran, Lebanon and Syria, North Korea, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Cuba. You know, it's a long list of countries, Russia, China, and so on. Long list of countries that face direct, specific US sanctions, economic sanctions, diplomatic sanctions, and a range of other kinds of sanctions. These are all illegal because there's no UN Security Council resolution. So what the United States is doing is, the United States says, look, there is the UN-based system, the UN Charter, and then the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and then there's the US system. And that the United States government only follows the US system, or what the United States government calls the rules-based order. But what they mean by rules-based order is the US system. What the US president says goes. They don't have to go to the UN. And so in that way, the United States government is undermining the United Nations. It's conducting these sanctions operations against a country like Venezuela, Cuba, which are illegal because they are against international law. But they do it because they are a powerful country. It's a little bit like in your playground. The teacher sets certain rules. You know, there may be a list of things in your classroom. You know, don't do this, be kind to your other students, do that, and so on. And the teacher has framed rules, and on the first day of class you come in and you agree to the rules. And that's the UN-based system. There's a set of rules that we've all agreed to. It's the greatest consensus document, the UN Charter. And then you get to the playground, and then the biggest, toughest kid out there says, forget all that. These are my rules. That's the bully's rules. And so in that sense, the United States government operates on the world stage like a bully. And that's how most of us see it. We don't see the United States government as a great follower of the UN Charter or the UN Declaration of Human Rights. We actually see the United States government as a bully, or in fact, as a mafia don. It's like the Godfather, you know, that's how it behaves. It sets its own rules. This is very bad for humanity. We came together in the aftermath of World War II, developed a system, came and put together a document called the UN Charter. Everybody agreed to it, a binding document. Then 3 years later, we agreed to a non-binding document called the International Declaration of Human Rights. Beautiful text, and I hope you've all read it. Beautiful text. Between the Charter and the UN Declaration of Human Rights, you have a lot of hope and expectation, and we still do. We still hold fast to these two texts. In fact, the government of Venezuela last year set up a group of about 18 countries around the world that represent 25% of the world's people, called the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter. And At that time, the foreign minister of Venezuela, Jorge Ariaza, joked with me and said, today, if they brought the UN Charter to a vote, it would be vetoed by the United States. And I think Ariaza is probably right. He's currently running for governor in the state of Barinas. He's no longer the foreign minister, but what he said then is correct. If the UN Charter came for a vote today in front of the General Assembly, the United States will vote against it. If it came to the Security Council, the US government might veto it, principally because it doesn't abide by it. We don't say that you have to abide by, common sense or anything like that, because common sense can mean anything. But at least on the 10th of December, International Human Rights Day, we should ask that the governments of the world abide by the only binding treaty that everybody has signed, and that's the UN Charter. And we should ask them to seriously consider the provisions in the International Declaration of Human Rights, admittedly non-binding, but beautiful. Wouldn't it be better to live in a world where people were housed, clothed, educated, less unhealthy, happier, able to communicate with each other with a decent sense of cultural belonging? Wouldn't that be better? I mean, think about this. Homelessness is increasing around the planet. Panhandlers are increasing. At the same time, money is developing in such a way that people are not carrying cash anymore, just digital money. So you have a situation where they don't even have change to give to a panhandler. There are two worlds out there. The world of those with credit cards and, Apple Pay, and the world of those in rags who have nothing. I don't want to erase the world of Apple Pay. I want to erase the world of the rags. We want the people in rags to live a life of dignity. That's what we should pledge to do on International Human Rights Day. Again, I'm sorry that I'm not with you, but it's not my fault. It's not the fault of the people of Venezuela. It's not the fault of the government of Venezuela. It's the fault of an illegal sanctions regime that I very much hope you will also pledge to dismantle because it's illegal. Thanks a lot.
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Prashad for preparing an insightful lecture despite the technical difficulties. I think he offered some great ideas about how we in New Haven can build a system to feed the hungry and eliminate houselessness. And he encouraged us to uphold the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I encourage each of you to review the Declaration for yourselves and hold your government officials and community leaders accountable. At this time, I think we could take some questions. Unfortunately, Dr. Prashad won't be able to answer them for you, but if there's questions you have for us about the Amistad Committee or the essay contest, we'd be happy for you to post those questions at this time in the chat.
I want to kind of echo what Dr. Prasad said and kind of contrast how very different things are now than when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was proposed. One of the major sponsors of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was Eleanor Roosevelt. And a lot of the kind of thinking behind that came from what the Roosevelt administration called the four freedoms that we were fighting for in World War II. And some of you remember Norman Rockwell did a series of paintings on the four freedoms. So just to contrast that, I mean, in some ways that was like a kind of mainstream thinking in the United States in the 1940s. And to see how far we've kind of devolved since then is really alarming. I mean, these kind of things, when they're proposed, were, largely non-controversial. People, regular folks in the United States, they believe in that, and they could see, why it was necessary, because we were in the middle of and just finishing a war against Nazism, fascism, authoritarianism. And so there was a lot of impetus to kind of push for some kind of international declaration. And so again, I think, as Dr. Prashad says, I really wonder whether the United States today would have signed off on the Declaration of Human Rights. It's a real shame. Mr. Henry Lohendorf has a question. It says, a wonderful presentation, and he asks how our Bill of Rights differ from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think in some ways the Universal Declaration of Human Rights deals with like kind of fundamental rights issues that as opposed to, some of them are similar. Like you could say that the First Amendment, which is, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, all these freedoms, freedom of religion, has its kind of its partner in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Other things in our Bill of Rights, you could probably kind of shoehole into one or another of the Universal Declaration, but I think I would say that the Declaration is much broader and it covers things that are just absent in our Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights has no kind of right to work, no kind of right to food, food and shelter, and these kind of, basic human rights that I think we think of these days. So in some ways, I think the Universal Declaration, while it covers much of the Bill of Rights, is much more kind of encompassing and deals with much more fundamental issues. I hope that answers the question. And I suspect, Mr. Lohendorf, that you probably know at least as much about how to answer this question than I do.
Okay, well, seeing no more questions, I think we'll close out. But before we do, I'd like to just thank Tom Thurston and Daniel Vieira and the team over at the Gilder Lehrman Center for hosting this webinar today. It will be available on YouTube and on Facebook. Is that correct, Tom?
Yes, that's right. And we have your email addresses, those of you who have signed on. So we'll be happy to send the links to those to the site to you so that you can ideally pass it on to friends. We'd like this to get a broad publication, broad viewing.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining the Amistad Committee on International Human Rights Day, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes, thank you. Bye.
Bye.